Rest of the agenda. All in favor? Opposed? The agenda is approved. Now we're to the minutes. Lots of Radina. Rest of the minutes. All in favor? Opposed? Approved. Unfinished business. Votes amendments to council rules.
So as I believe it was the last one, or perhaps the one before that, admin committee meeting, that Councilmember Iyer had brought up, looking at the rules to see if we can make sure that folks that are speaking to the agenda are earlier in the meeting and definitely have a chance to speak in the first 45 minutes instead of having to wait till the end. And so we went back and looked at the rules. The rules already have a system in them for prioritizing and the bucket for speaking to the agenda. But what the rules currently say is that you have to call between 8 a.m. and 1 p.m. so that you can be in the bucket that, then Jackie and her team then prioritize according to agenda items. If you call between 1 and 5, I think it's the first come, first serve. So really the only question is whether we want to extend that 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. time period to allow Jackie to take more people into account for prioritization, or should we just leave it the way it is? Jackie, from an administrative viewpoint, would like that time period to end by 4 p.m. at the latest because she needs some time to actually do the prioritization. But she is willing to go 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. if we wanted her to.
Isn't there another possibility, and that is if someone calls early and speaks to, that indicates that they're speaking on an item unrelated to the agenda, that just goes towards the back end, and if they, the priority set is established between 8 and 1, and then if there are stragglers that come in at 2 and they're speaking about an item, they just automatically go ahead of the person who's not speaking about it.
Yes, but that would be a little bit more complicated to write, but we can certainly take a stab at it. Yeah.
It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I would largely defer also to Jackie, because I know that we get that final agenda update with those folks added on the day of the meeting.
Yeah.
And so if we push, it usually comes around 4. If we push that back to 4, it would be even later. So cutting it closer to the meeting before we get any the absolute final agenda before the meeting.
So why don't I take Mayor Taylor's idea, run it by Jackie, and at the next meeting come to you with a proposal that Jackie thinks is administratively possible. Yeah.
Easiest for her.
Easiest for her. Okay, I can do that.
Do you need anything else from us on that?
No, I don't think I need a motion because there's nothing to move on yet.
Okay. Great. New business. Fournier.
I believe that is me. Sharing my screen.
Oh, I think it's the next Ryan. No, you're fine. I don't care.
I just need.
Yeah.
Okay, so we were requested there be a presentation on the Ann Arbor Municipal Airport, talking around kind of the history of the airport, how we got the airport, what public benefit there may be. So I'm going to run through that a little bit now. I'm going to start talking a little bit about the history of the airport. The land that is now the airport was acquired in 1913 for use as a water drinking source. You all may recall that we currently have wells for our drinking water on the property. About 15% of the water that comes into our water treatment plant is pumped out of ground source water from the property. In the 1920s, the federal government began incentivizing the expansion of small local and regional airports for airmail delivery. Mail was ground shipped at the time. They wanted to start moving mail over the air. But not many communities jumped on the bandwagon of building airports until 1927 when Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic. And then the nation became crazed with aviation, right? Including Ann Arbor. And I'll point out the picture at the very top here is a gentleman named Lieutenant Leonard S. Flo. He's an aviator who was the first person to fly from Canada to Florida in a nonstop trip. He was actually intending to go from Canada to Cuba, but had to stop in the Florida Keys with gastrointestinal discomfort. But he still set a record. Unfortunately for him, his flight virtually coincided with Charles Lindbergh's flight. So Lindbergh, having more impressive feat, got most of the fame. But Leonard S. Flo is also an Ann Arborite and was instrumental in the establishment of our airport. The first plane to land in Ann Arbor landed on May 19th, 1928. Lieutenant Flo piloted that aircraft along with Eli Gallup, who was the park superintendent for the city at the time, and a reporter from the Ann Arbor News. And around that time, the city council approved the expenditure of funds to build a terminal building and a hangar, which you see there on the bottom left. That building actually is still there today. It's maintained by one of our flying clubs. We have an FAA-powered airport. We're one of 15 airports in the state with an FAA tower on it. We're one of the oldest FAA-powered airports in the state. And we have actually a pretty strong legacy at the airport for pilot training, which continues to this day. And the history that we have there is really interesting because of the association with Lieutenant Flo, because we were one of the earliest airports in the country. There's actually a strong tradition of aviation there. There were a lot of air shows that were held there for the first several decades of its existence, with a lot of acrobatic aviation and flying that were fairly well known. And a lot of well-known pilots in the country actually trained here in Ann Arbor. I had ripped this headline from the bottom of an old Ann Arbor News article. It says, "City's airport among the oldest aviation legends traced here." And it really speaks to the history that we have for aviation here in Ann Arbor. Something else I want to mention is we were one of the first airports selected for FDR's civilian, it actually should say civilian pilot training program, CP2P in 1939. FDR was insistent on training civilians to be pilots. And Ann Arbor was among the first batch of programs selected nationally. The individual pictured here is Donald R. Knapp. He was the first pilot certified under the civilian pilot training program at Ann Arbor Airport in 1939. At the time the program was launched, there were only a few thousand pilots licensed in the United States. But by the time the United States entered World War II, there were a massive number of, I think it was a tenfold increase. And that program can really trace its roots here to the University of Michigan. So we have this really interesting history of aviation. That's essentially why we have the airport. You can trace the development of the airport through three main periods. The first one, I would say, is the founding period from 1928 to World War II. Primary activities there were mail service, commercial shipping, and essentially flight enthusiasts. People who wanted to take off and fly to various locations, improve their feet, and, engage in various acrobatics. There were intrepid residents who would say, "Oh, great, you're flying to Cincinnati with a plane full of chickens. Here's $1.50. I'll sit in the cargo hold while you go there." Right? That kind of stuff was really common at the Ann Arbor Airport. After World War II, the federal government's approach to aviation changed quite a bit. Realizing the importance that aviation had for national defense, there were a number of federal laws passed that incentivized the development of our airports away from grassy fields, or in the case of Ann Arbor, we had a tiled runway. Haven't quite figured out what that means yet, but it's mentioned over the city council meeting. And onto paved runways and terminal buildings and runways that were long enough to accept larger aircraft. And so We kind of moved into that period, the post-war period from 1945 to 1960. The airport's actually located on a state road instead of in its current location. There are a lot of charter flights. There was a robust air taxi service, so people could drive to Ann Arbor Airport and take an air taxi to all kinds of airports around the state, around the region. Shipping is still a big industry, and flight schools and pilot training remain a really important activity at the airport at this point. And then there's kind of the modern period. Beginning in 1956, the city of Ann Arbor accepted a grant of federal dollars to relocate and expand the airport, build a new terminal building, which is where the airport is today. That's when the current landing strip was built. And the nature of the airport changed a little bit in that time, mainly because in the 60s, commercial aviation really, no pun intended, but really took off. And airports like Detroit Metro and Willow Run and Lansing and Grand Rapids and things like that really took over the commercial airport traffic, you know, the Pan Ams of the world and Continentals and what have you. And airports like Ann Arbor moved away from conveying passengers and moved toward private business activity and travel. Flight schools and training still remain a really important part of the airport today. We have a charter for the Civil Air Patrol. Medical transport is really important. So that is really what makes up the majority of the activity of the airport right now. And I'll expand a little bit on business activity and travel. We get some degree of very, smaller corporate jets there. But we have also airport-related business. AV Fuel is located there. Before AV Fuel was there, Discount Tire actually had a major corporate office at the airport, did a lot of corporate travel out there. A lot of recognizable corporations in Western Wayne County and in Washtenaw County and in Toronto County do travel a lot of our airport. And so that's kind of the basis of the business activity. So how busy is our airport? You look at the chart here at the left, that's kind of year by year, our airport activity. Peaking in like 1999, where we approached about 140,000 operations annually. You'll notice things start to fall off after that. Airplane travel at an airport like ours kind of ebbs and flows with the economy. As money tightens, the first thing that goes is, somebody who decided they want to get their pilot's license or, something like that. So the tech bubble bursting impacted us, probably more significantly reforms to flight schools, who has access to them and the types of inspections and licensures you need to operate them changed quite a bit after September 11th. And that impacted all airports, not just us. So that kind of depressed the activity at our airport, but you can see in recent years, activity at the airport has increased and is continuing to increase. And then on the right side here, this is a chart of the busiest airports in the state of Michigan and also their runway length, which I think is important. All of these are FAA-powered airports. Obviously, Detroit Metro is the busiest, also has the largest runway. Oakland International Airport or Pontiac Airport is also what they call a general aviation airport, which is what we are. That means that we don't run commercial airline services out of the airport at all. Battle Creek, Willow Run, and Traverse City all run commercial traffic on their airport. And then Ann Arbor is actually the 6th busiest airport in the state of Michigan. You'll notice our runway at 3,505 feet is quite a bit smaller than other airports. That's frankly done intentionally. We have citizen oversight of our airport. There has always been interest in keeping our airport smaller and catering to the Class B2 aircraft. And so that's how we've guided the airport over the years, keeping it this smaller size. This is a sampling of the type of aircraft that fly out of our airport. And the green box is around the B2 turboprops. That's what gives us the Class B2 distinction. I don't know exactly how the FAA arrives at this conclusion, but this is kind of the most critical class of airport or airplane that runs out of our airport. We also have Class B2 jets, the Cessna Citation and the Embraer Phenom fly in and out of our airport. But most of the actual traffic is the B1 and A1 airlines, airplanes, for flight schools and for personal travel and local travel and things like that. And so this is mostly what we get. Even with the proposed safety improvements to the runway, we would still be a Class B2 airport. We don't anticipate the mix of airplanes or the volume of airplanes traveling in and out of the airport to change at all with the runway. Mostly because the cutoff is really about 5,000 feet. If your runway gets above 5,000 feet, you get a different class of airplane. Below 5,000 feet, this is really what we want. So a little bit on the economic impact of the airport. The last economic evaluation we did is in 2016, so admittedly it probably has to be updated, but given our, day-to-day awareness of what's happening at the airport, we don't think these numbers have fundamentally changed a lot. The airport directly employs about 339 FTEs. What that means is these are people whose paychecks is directly dependent on economic activity at the airport. 82 of those FTEs actually work physically at the location. The remainder of them work off-site, but again, their paycheck is dependent on business activity at the airport. It indirectly supports another 199 FTEs. This is people who, based on the consultant's research, they think that because of the economic activity and kind of the tertiary economic benefits, that paychecks are supported. The airport creates about $93.7 million in economic activity annually. Nearly 90% of that is located in the Ann Arbor. So it is a pretty significant contributor to employment and to economic activity. It's also a really important location for medical transport and for U of M survival flight. The survival flight helicopters are based out of our airport. That's where their maintenance bay is. They oftentimes take off and land out of our airport. Sometimes they'll land directly at the hospital. Sometimes they'll land at the airport and an ambulance will meet them there. We also have volunteer medical transport organizations that service our airport. Wings of Mercy, Angel Flight, and Lifeline Pilots are among them. These are for people who need medical treatment at an area hospital, either St. Joe's or U of M, but who don't qualify for a survival flight and can't afford air travel otherwise. So these are pilots who volunteer their time and their resources to transport people into the area so they can receive specialty care at our hospitals. They prefer to fly in and out of Ann Arbor Airport because Willow Run and Detroit Metro are not comfortable takeoff and landing locations for smaller aircraft, like the Class B, B2, and B1 and B1 aircraft that we have. North Flight EMS is also an emergency medical transport service that services hospitals all over the state. They bring people in to Ann Arbor for medical attention that they might need at U of M Hospital or at St. Joe's. Same thing with them. They prefer to work out of our airport because of the size of the facility. It's just a much more comfortable place for them to fly in and out of. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is Willow Run is the next closest airport. It is not as comfortable of a facility for pilots, but it's also twice the distance from U of M Hospital. And that is, that factor matters when you're transporting people for emergency. Like I said before, this is the Civil Air Patrol is also located here, the Major Kevin A. Adams Memorial Squadron. Civil Air Patrol is a volunteer civilian auxiliary force of the United States Air Force. They do search and rescue, medical transport, local aid relief. They're also a really important operation for pilot training. Like I said, we have, I'll get into this on the next slide, but we're actually one of the most active and important pilot training centers in the state of Michigan. We do a lot of pilot training at our airport. That is an activity that federal government really wants. out of local and regional airports. That's why they promote it through Single Air Patrol. And like I said, we're the second busiest general aviation airport in the state behind the Oakland County International Airport. So that kind of speaks to the kind of importance of the level of activity that's adapted. So state and federal aviation authorities have a clear interest in maintaining airports that are quality training centers for new pilots for a whole number of reasons. A, there's a pilot shortage in the country right now. So maintaining these kinds of facilities is really important for the integrity of our airline industry and our transportation system. There are important defense reasons why you want to have a group of people who are trained as pilots and who can be ready to step up if needed. And so, you know, for those reasons, it's an important public policy objective for our federal and state aviation agencies to make sure that pilot training stay with them. So what if we didn't have the airport? This is, given what we know about the airport, pretty easy to answer. We would essentially be laying off more than 500 employees. We lose about $100 billion in annual economic activity in the region. Medical transport to and from the hospital would become more difficult. We would lose some Civil Air Patrol resources, and a valuable pilot training center would be lost, notably in the middle of the pilot village. So I want to talk a little bit about, you know, our history with FAA grants. I don't want to get into, you know, I can talk about this for like 2 hours. It's just a labyrinth of documents, requirements, what have you. But the FAA provides grant funding to maintain capital assets for a large network of airports, the big airports and the small airports, all over the country. And those grant agreements have guarantees that are written into them. For us to accept those grants, we have to guarantee certain. One of those guarantees is that the FAA and MDOT have the first right of refusal to operate the airport if the city ever says we no longer want to do this. Okay. They also require some federal money to be paid back to the FAA. So, for instance, right now, if we just hypothetically speaking said tomorrow, we don't want to run this airport anymore, we owe the federal government $4.3 billion just to get out of it. In some instances, for some federal grant dollars, and those are grant dollars related to the acquisition of land for an airport, the FAA requires deed restrictions that make some of these requirements permanent. We have accepted FAA grant dollars for property acquisition at the airport. We're in the process of investigating kind of lineage documents around those, so I can't make any declaratory statements right now about what they mean, but that's something for you all to keep. So I want to talk also a little bit about the runway safety project. Council directed the runway safety project in both 2007 and 2008, which is why we began this project. The extension of the runway was recommended by the FAA for safety reasons, and there are a couple reasons why. This project would shift the runway 150 feet to the southwest and would extend it 720 feet, which would put it, I think, at 4,220 feet. There are three main issues. There's a line of sight issue with the current FAA-owned tower. They can't actually physically see the beginning of the runway. That has not contributed to safety issues at the airport historically, but the FAA doesn't like it. They want us to move. So there's a line of sight issue there. It lengthens the runway to what is the recommended length for a Class B2 airport and for Class B2 aircraft. We have had 11 overruns at our airport since 1998. Those are instances where a plane literally runs over the end of the airport into the grassy field. In all of the airports in the rest of the state of Michigan combined in that time, there have only been 2 overruns. We've had 11. And it also improves the landing approach to a 34-to-1 angle. It's currently a 20-to-1 angle. And what that means is because the airport runway begins a little too close to State Street, a little too close to other property uses, right now, pilots have to come in at a sharper angle than is recommended. By shifting the runway 150 feet, it actually lowers the approach angle. and creates a little bit of a better landing environment. And so there's a fourth issue here as well, which is in warmer weather, airplanes have to have lower weight on them to take off and land, which for our airplanes means they can't take off and land most of the time with a full fuel. Which means if they want to go from point A to point B in the winter, they can make a theoretical point A to point B trip in one flight operation, but in the summer, they have to stop in the middle of fuel. And, you know, the most dangerous point of a flight is to take off and land. Once you're in the air, it's actually statistically pretty easy to go. The FAA is invested in the idea that we should have fewer takeoffs and landings for people to get from point A to point B for safety. So with a longer runway, it kind of extends the safety environment of the takeoffs and landings, and it allows planes to be fully fueled as they get off in the air. So that is the impetus for the runway project. That's why the FAA wants us to do it. We would remain a Class B2 airport. The type of aircraft taking off and landing at the airport would not change. You know, the type of activity at the airport would not change. We're not really crossing the length threshold to have a fundamental shift there in terms of the type of traffic that we're getting. But it would just be a safer environment for the people who are operating there. And here is a bit of bonus history for you, unrelated to airplanes, but you may have heard this property referred to as Steer Farm at one point, because it is named for Joseph Neal Steer, who was a naturalist, linguist, archaeologist, and is perhaps best known as a zoologist. Traveled the world, cataloging all kinds of birds and fish and mammals and plants, but is probably best known for his work in the Philippines. Has several species of birds named for him, including Steer's Lutetia and the Azurobreasted Pita. He was the first person ever given an honorary doctorate from the University of Michigan for his work. He came back and became an assistant professor and a curator at the U of M Museum of Natural History, where he donated his own collection, but was unfortunately forced to resign in 1894 from the university for his activism around temperance, which upset the community. And so the board made him resign, and he retired to a parcel of property down on State Road where he worked as a farmer for approximately 20 years. At which point, when he retired from farming, he sold the property to the city of Ann Arbor for us to use as wellhead property. So you may think that Steer was just a farmer, but he's actually a fairly notable zoologist who contributed a lot to our understanding of the natural environment. I just thought that was really cool. Are there any questions?
What is the next step?
Yeah, where are we proceeding?
We're waiting for a letter from the federal government declaring a finding of no significant impact to the environmental assessment that we just completed at the airport. When that letter is received, we're fairly confident we'll receive it. When that letter is received, we will bring forth construction contracts to the city council to the extension. The timing of that depends on when we receive the funding.
Are you expecting it sort of any time, or?
We're expecting it at some point in the next 6 months. I couldn't tell you specifically when. The federal government works on its own.
Okay. There is a strong feeling in my ward, belief that this expansion would result in larger aircraft flying in. Why is that?
I do not know. The city has communicated very clearly for a long time that that is not our intent, and we do not believe that that would be the case. So we think that this will definitely remain a Class B2 airport, and we don't think that this extension will have an impact on the type of aircraft.
So to piggyback on that, is it has B2 aircraft, B1 aircraft, and A1 aircraft, all of which are in the mix in a B2 airport. Is a longer B2 airport more likely to have higher level B2, like the jets and the turboprops that are B2 and fewer A1s, for example?
We don't,
So like altering the mix within the B2 category.
we don't think so. The jets actually make up a very small amount of our air traffic right now.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but that could be related to the 35.
No, it's related to the hangar space.
Well,
Yeah,
Right. We have,
it's been positive that it's related to this.
yeah,
I guess.
we don't think that that is the case. Those aircraft are capable of landing there now, and it's come from their higher points out. You know, we have tried to kind of limit the expansion of the airport. There's high demand for hangar space there. We haven't, built a whole lot, and so we don't think that the alterations to the runway are going to change the type of aircraft.
Even within the category.
Yes.
yeah, I jumped in because I asked
Yeah,
a
no, sorry.
question, of the airport folks. And, I got a whole, spreadsheet of all of the possible, aircraft and which one would, so I'd have to look it up again, but it was, a handful, that could potentially land at the airport with the additional 500 feet, but there's no hangar space for them. Most of them would not fit in any of our hangars. And the one that would, there's, or maybe there were two that would, but there's already, those hangars are full and there's a very long wait list.
Right.
So
Do we see,
unless we're building more hangars, that's, right.
I'm not bringing anything forward to build hangar. I mean, we're just talking about this
Yeah.
AV project. And
Yeah.
making sure plans are over.
do we see increased traffic, on game days? And I guess my question is if, I guess do planes need hangar space to fly in on the 7, Saturdays of, the football, home football games? Is that a significant portion of our jet traffic?
So what's interesting actually is that on game days, so one of the changes to airports that happened after September 11th is the proximity they can get to major assets that represent a public safety risk, the big house being chief among them. So the number of planes that can be up in the air with banner advertisements and how close they can actually get to the stadium changed significantly, and that cut down a huge amount on our game day traffic. Right, that is one of the things that majorly contributed to the decline in airplane traffic. We have limited parking at the airport that's even outside of hangar space, so you can't just put, it's not like going to a tailgate. You can't land and roll it off in the grass somewhere, right? Leave it there. So I don't anticipate that would have a big impact. I'd have to look back at the environmental assessment to see if I can get a more specific answer for you. Without the addition of more parking space and more hangar space, you're not going to see a noticeable difference.
Thanks.
There appears to be considerable opposition to expansion from our municipal neighbors. To what extent have we engaged with Pittsfield, for example, in conversation around this? And, they've been pretty consistent for decades in opposition, but have we engaged with them recently about this?
So they've been engaged in the environmental assessment process. I know through my time here, I've had conversations with Pittsfield Township leadership about it. They've taken advantage of the opportunities to give public comment. We have contact with municipal leaders in their government, not just at the administrator level, the airport manager. So there is a give and take there, but they are opposed to it. And that fact remains.
just a follow-up to that.
It was just
Yeah.
for the same reason that some residents are opposed to it. Is it the belief that it would increase traffic?
I think it's the belief that it would increase traffic, but I don't want to speak for everybody who's.
Sure, okay.
Everybody who's placed application.
Do we know the breakdown? So I mean, most compelling to me are the medical uses, the training uses. Do we know the breakdown of how much is actually, private versus commercial versus medical, like all of the different types of uses of the airport?
We do, I can get those figures for you.
Okay.
I want to quote them.
Yeah.
I hit numbers in my head, but I wouldn't want to be inaccurate, so I can get.
And then with respect to some of the federal and state obligations, if in the future Ann Arbor were to say, we want out of this hypothetically, and FAA or MDOT takes up the opportunity to run the airport, does Ann Arbor then lose all kind of say in the airport?
We would lose all control over it. And something to keep in mind about that is that the airport is the size that it is. But again, a runway, 1/4 to half the size of the other runways in the state, because we have citizen oversight locally, and we have a strong interest to keep it as a small airport. Our airport is profitable as it is run right now. If it were to be taken over by MDOT or the FAA, they could privatize it. If it becomes a federal property, nobody, us, Pittsfield, nobody has a say really in what happens. And so, if the nature of the airport could change significantly, and there is enough land there, we could build a 5,000 or 6,000 foot runway. So if it goes into private ownership and if it goes under the FAA, that is a possibility, for sure.
Question along the similar lines. If we currently, I think you said, would we be obligated to return 4.3 million to the federal government in that circumstance? Is there an expiration on that?
So what we are aware of right now is there is a 20-year expiration. Well, there are some other provisions of these grant agreements that exist in perpetuity, and we are investigating that right now. I can't answer that with certainty.
And I think my last question, is there obligation for public noticing, public hearing, feedback on an expansion? And what would the kind of criteria be for that?
I'll have to get back to you. Okay. There has been a lot of public notice and public hearing through the environmental assessment. Right. So as far as our obligations moving forward, we'll report.
Thank you.
One concern I've heard raised is that with both an extended and a shifted runway, you're moving full set, 870 feet. So, in one direction, thereby you're putting the end of the runway that much closer to the proximate residents. Therefore, the planes that are leaving, that part of that runway will be lower in elevation over those proximate residents, because they're, the triangle starts closer to them. And the angle of descent, I assume, stays consistent.
So part of the environmental assessment required us to do a sound impact study. And, where you essentially study the acoustics of the airplanes and how they affect the various properties around it. And the result of that study is that we would have no real impact on sound impacts in the neighborhood. So, keep in mind that I don't have a modern map of the airport that's pretty much changed. I would make an oversight. But keep in mind that, west of the airport property are actually 2 tracts of agricultural land, that remain agricultural. Right? The runway doesn't move over there. And the runway actually goes down to the southwest. So planes taking off from the runway in that direction, fly over forested area, wetland, and farmland before they get over houses. And by the time they get over houses, the vast majority of our airplanes have reached an elevation here. They're not really capital. The type of operation, interestingly enough, the type of operations where we get the most complaints are, the kind of in and out, takeoff, landing, and circle around the airport for flight schools. The kind of first time, here's your first plane lesson, this is the instrument panel. We're just going to circle the port for a while so you just know it. The understanding of what we hear is that the class of airplane that comes in and out of here will change, and it's about jets or it's about speed and whatnot. That's not contributing to the sound issues at the airport. Because when a jet takes off, by the time it gets over anybody's house, it is powerful enough to have reached an elevation where the sound impacts are. And so it's the kind of beginning stage flight school operations that generate the most sound impact. Somewhat counterintuitive, but as these things go,
I mean, that's consistent with the experience. I mean, we often have some of the smaller planes fly over my neighborhood, and it's the smaller prop planes that are the noisy.
Yeah, the lower altitude.
Yep.
Your seatbelt is located to the left. Yeah. That kind of stuff is what we get.
I guess one in the list of questions that might be helpful in a report. And I know you said over and over that the city doesn't expect the jet traffic to increase, but if there could be a number around maybe the maximum amount of jet traffic that could occur given those current constraints, like you're saying, with the hangars and the parking, but just like what the conceivable maximum could be, because I've seen the estimates that are coming staying the same, but I've also seen kind of the amount of traffic that comes into a kind of real run on game days that makes you think, well, some of that might be able to shift over, but if there's a number that could kind of say, here's the absolute worst case, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
And to piggyback on that, a fleshed out understand. So there are a number of limiting factors, I guess, when it comes to what comes into an airport. One of which is runway, or another which I'm hearing today, and perhaps hasn't fully appreciated, is hangar space for what I assume to be permanent locations, but parking for what I assume to be not permanent locations. To what extent, I guess, communication about why that's why that's a fact, why that is a limiting factor that ought to give people who are concerned about the airport comfort, or not if it doesn't. But why that's a thing that we should be thinking about as we reflect upon the impact of the airport and the impact of the potential change.
I assume we also have on-site emergency fire personnel, things like that, or are they serviced by somewhere nearby? Does this change impact the needs for that at all? Increase or decrease?
I can ask that question. Nothing bubbled up to my consciousness. Like we don't have a fire station on site, right?
But it's not far.
Yeah.
It's one in the area.
Right.
The fuel station right now?
This is right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
remembering incorrectly from the tour I did was not that long after I got here. Don't the University of Michigan team charters fly out of there?
That I don't recall. They may fly out of Willow. I think that's a larger airplane.
Not the football.
When the basketball team ran off the runway, it was that Willow Run.
Yeah,
Was it?
I mean, the Embraer airplanes can't fit in that scope. Maybe it's called.
Actually, it would be maybe helpful to know to what extent the university uses it beyond emergency service, because I actually think a lot of their flights fly out of Willow Run.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
You hear about, I guess, the environmental, in terms of, this all goes along with the jet stuff, but basically, I know that the OSI keeps a expanded inventory of emissions, and I know that I believe the expanded inventory includes the airport. So I'm wondering if, as part of this, does kind of OSI, give anything on any emissions increases from the, expected from increased traffic? As well as part of the feedback process, because I don't think the environmental assessment includes, I think, emissions. I don't think it includes that.
Since we don't expect the runway project itself to contribute to an increase in overall traffic.
Right.
However, there may be savings there if we are, by expanding the runway, we're causing planes to be able to get from point A to point B without refueling.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to give you some efficiency improvements. But I can follow up with our airport manager with this.
Yeah. No, yeah, the only reason I asked that is because that's something that I've heard in like public comment a couple times, and I think in emails. So yeah, just all the information we can provide to kind of all the information we can provide to answer questions to the state. So thank you, appreciate that.
Yeah. Thank you. Information and or upcoming business?
Because it's Monday, you might want to show up.
Good deal. All right, now time for public comment. There's nobody in house who I assume is going to be giving public comment. So is there anyone online who would like to speak at public comment? There's an opportunity to speak to the committee and the community about matters of municipal interest. If you wish to speak at public comment, there are 3 minutes in which to speak. Our intrepid staff member will notify you when your time is expired. If you wish to speak, please do so, or please indicate that you wish to speak by entering *9 or raising your hand if you're on Zoom. Seeing no one, public comment is closed. I have a motion to adjourn, please. Moved by Radina. Discussion? All in favor? Opposed? We're adjourned. Goodbye.